Hey, welcome to the first of the two development videos. Today we're going to talk about cognitive development. Off we go. Before you start, actually, I'd like you to head over to this other video. Just watch the first 2 or 3 minutes or so. I have a general TED Talk kind of rant that I think hasn't appeared in any of these videos yet, so I'll just do it really quickly. TED Talk videos tend to be kind of wide-ranging and big, like galaxy-brained in most of their runtime, but usually the first couple minutes, particularly when the speaker is a scientist, describes an individual study. And so I don't want to encourage you to watch TED Talks and take away that the whole thing is scientifically minded, but often the first couple minutes are. And then the person will kind of go off and talk about big giant goals and kind of really hopeful and optimistic visions for the future. And so Dr. Alison Gopnik gave a TED Talk some years ago that it is really interesting, but the first couple minutes can serve as a really nice intro to this video. So go ahead and watch it and then come back to this slide once you do so. We can talk about it a little bit. It's a really interesting study. So she describes a study in which they ask really small toddlers and babies to recommend a piece of food to a research assistant, who's usually like an adult person. Imagine a young grad student. The grad student will either show the baby beforehand that they like goldfish, fish crackers, those cheesy crackers, or that they prefer broccoli. And then they'll tell the baby, "I'm hungry, which do you want to offer me?" And in previous literature and in sort of the history of our understanding of childhood cognition, we would have previously thought that the babies would only ever offer cheddar cheese flavored crackers and never really bothered to offer broccoli to anybody else, because we thought they had an egocentric approach to their cognition. We thought that they only sort of knew about their own preferences. But Dr. Gopnik's study showed that babies actually have an idea of other people's preferences. They maybe develop theory of mind quite a lot earlier than we previously thought. So she's done a lot of research on this topic and others over the years. She calls babies and young children the R&D division of the human species. That's cute, so I like to say it. But she talks about, over the rest of the video, her kind of general approach to developmental research, which I think is consolidated in this quote. And it's a nice way to think about developmental psychology, particularly cognitive developmental psychology, because what we're looking at is the development of these skills and mental faculties that we're talking about in all of our other chapters. So if you really want to look and figure out how something is built, how something works, well, I ruined that in the sentence. If you want to know how something works, you can look into how it's built to figure it out. And the way to look at how cognition is built is to watch babies build it. So that's kind of my interpretation of this R&D division quote, and basically the way that I think about developmental psychology in general. So we'll talk about some of the history of developmental psych today, particularly the cognitive aspects. We'll think about the basic methodologies psychologists have developed to do research with babies and toddlers, and then we'll talk about the probably most influential and known researcher and theorist in developmental psych. His name was Piaget. And then we'll talk about, I don't think we have the nature-nurture controversy in this, so you can skip over that one. We'll talk a little bit about some alternatives to Piaget, and we'll talk a little bit about aging in a more general sense, thinking about transitioning from adulthood into older adulthood toward the end. So research with infants has a couple of really solid, tried and true methodologies, the first of which is called the preferential looking technique. In this, researchers show an infant two things. If the infant looks longer at one of the things, the researchers know the infant can distinguish between the two, first of all, and also that the one they look at more is the one they find more interesting. So there's two things you can learn from the preferential looking technique. If the baby looks at both an equal amount of time, you don't really know whether they find one or the other more interesting, and you can't really tell whether they can distinguish. But if they prefer one, then you know a couple of things about those two stimuli. Another method takes advantage of the orienting reflex. This is humans' general tendency from babyhood on to pay more attention to new stimuli than to stimuli to which they've become habituated or grown accustomed. So even from birth, babies look more quickly away from something familiar than from something unfamiliar. Think about it like if you see something new, it might be kind of puzzling at first, and you're going to have to look at it a little longer to figure it out. Whereas if you see something you've seen before, you only need maybe a second or less of exposure to it before you figure out what it is and what it could possibly do. So you show the infant a picture or some object until they're familiar enough to become bored and look away. And you can see that the amount of time the infant looks at the stimulus declines over the number of instances in which you show it that picture or that object. And so what you do then is you change it in some way, the object or the picture, and if the baby looks longer at it than they had been looking previously, then they notice the difference. And if they look at it about the same amount or less, then you assume they can't distinguish the new piece of it. So if you're showing them a painting and you add a new image in the middle of the painting and they look at it just as long as they had been, you know that they didn't notice the new thing in the painting. These two relatively simple techniques have enabled an enormous number of conclusions and yielded lots and lots of data about perceptual abilities in babies, whether they understand words, how they recognize faces, their understanding of numbers, and that they have this kind of really fast and early realization of the laws of physics, things like gravity and figure versus ground in images. So I invite you to think about how you would design some research with infants if you had these kinds of similar questions. If you wanted to know what age children started to have a basic idea of addition and subtraction, how would you design it? Pause the video and think about it for a minute before you go on. Keep in mind that they don't get numbers, so you can't just write numbers out. You have to represent those numbers in some other way. Think about the preferential looking technique or the orienting reflex. So this has actually been done before with a sample of 9-month-olds. The researchers used the habituation paradigm in the orienting reflex research to see if the infants were surprised when they were presented with wrong answers to addition and subtraction problems. So the way they did that is they sat them in front of a computer monitor where there were 5 blocks on the screen, and then a panel came in front and covered all the blocks, and then they could see 5 more blocks kind of dance their way behind the panel. So then when you remove the panel, you should expect to see 10 blocks. And according to the orienting reflex data, so did the infants. They looked at the screen longer when the panel was lifted to only show 5 blocks behind the panel. So they expected the addition to have happened there. It was a surprisingly clear understanding of quantity shown by these 9-month-olds. So it's not something we knew previously. So that's a specific example of a time that the orienting reflex was really helpful and informative for psychology. Cognitive development in general deals with, of course, cognition, which we've already talked about in a lot of different ways, but basically all the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating are kind of encapsulated by the term cognition. And that includes all the stuff we've dealt with, memory, problem solving, figuring out how the world works, trying to develop models and concepts and establish categories, storing knowledge, retrieving knowledge, understanding and using language, using self-talk, having metacognition, having inner thoughts. And this field in general was pioneered by Jean Piaget, who worked beginning in the early-ish 1900s and actually lived until 1980. He's basically the progenitor of all modern developmental psychology. And the reason is because his theories have been very influential. So to back up just a little bit, developmental psychology, particularly developmental cognitive psychology, is going to focus on the change in cognition across the lifespan. But developmental psychology in general deals with more than this. It deals with physical change and social change and emotional change. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next video. But they deal with questions like how much of any particular mental faculty is influenced by nature, by your genetics, and how much of it is influenced by nurture, by your environment. So that's that classic nature-nurture argument. That's something that developmental psychologists deal with all the time. Said a little bit differently, they ask, how does our genetic inheritance interact with our experiences to influence our development? And like many questions in psychology, the answer is it depends, but you can often find it leaning in one direction or another for a particular faculty of the mind, for a particular piece of cognition sometimes. Another question developmental psychologists deal with is whether we should be separating development into continuity or stages. So there seem to be some aspects of development that are gradual and continuous, and then there are others that appear to turn on a dime one day versus another. They change very, very abruptly. And so there's lots of debate over which aspects of development are continuous and which change in stage form. Another question that is really interesting in developmental psych to me in particular is the question of stability versus change. We are one person our entire lives. Most folks, some people might feel like they change at some point, but in order to maintain a kind of image of who we are and to understand who we are as people throughout our lives, we need some kind of idea of continuity in our consciousness and continuity in our personality and our traits and our general behaviors and who we are at our core. But at the same time, we also need to be aware of and feeling like we can change at any time as well. We need to not feel trapped in who we are at any particular moment. And so this is another question that developmental psychologists ask: which of our traits persist and which change through life? Which change as we develop and which do not? I'm going to dive a little bit into one of these, and that's the continuity and stages question. So some researchers see development as a kind of feeling of experience over time. It's continuous, it's gradual, it is pushed mostly by the environment surrounding the person and their experiences. Where other researchers focus on biological or physical maturation, sometimes see things like literal physical growth spurts or other physical changes that make one stage of development very different from another. So to try to compare the two becomes a little difficult and maybe even doesn't make sense if you consider the huge biological change that has happened between one stage and the next. So you can kind of combine two of the questions on the previous slide by thinking about how nurture tends to have continuous effects on development, and nature seems to have stage-type effects on development. But again, it depends on the aspect of the person that we're talking about, whether it develops continuously or in stages, and depends on the theory of the psychologist you're talking to. Some might have very reasonable alternate theories about the exact same piece of cognition. And just to think a little bit more about stability and change, I think I've kind of said most of this already, but in general, it seems like temperament is stable across long periods of time, most of life, but traits can vary, personality traits can vary, our attitudes about issues, of course, vary quite a lot over time. Our ability to use and actual use of coping strategies changes, our work habits change, our socializing styles change. It does seem true, though, that personality stabilizes as we age. Children vary quite a lot in their personality in the first few years, but then we kind of figure out who we are and want to be, and then we stabilize. And that stability helps us form something that's really critical through teen years, which is an individualized identity. We figure out who we feel like we are on a day-to-day basis, and we need that feeling of continuity to feel healthy and happy in our lives. But at the same time, we still need to feel potential for change so that we feel like we have control over our lives, also to maintain healthy, happy relationships with ourselves and others. There's some memory work that suggests we don't change all that much, but what we actually do is sort of forget, and then maybe we don't actively change. We don't say I'm moving from this opinion to that opinion or from this strategy to that one. We kind of forget our old method and then adopt a new one, or forget our old opinion and adopt a new one. And that helps us kind of not need to reproduce our self-image. We have trouble, in fact, reproducing the exact same thing from moment to moment or from month to month. This is work by Mike Ross from the late 80s, if you're curious about that. Really, really interesting memory work. Now, I've posed a couple of questions on the screen here, and they are whether infants are just inexperienced humans, or if their mind and brain works in a qualitatively different way than the adult mind. So, in other words, is an infant exactly structured in their brain and in their learning as I am, as you are? Or do they have some kind of fully different approach to the world and to learning what's around them and to memorizing and problem solving that changes as we age? Does our mind work in a totally different way than theirs, in a way that we can't kind of imagine? Piaget believed that. He believed the last of these questions was true. The answer was yes. He separated development into 4 stages, which he thought represented totally different approaches to and understandings of the world around babies. This video describing some of it here, and you've certainly seen it in the textbook. But I've got a tool here for you to fill in with everything you can remember. So grab onto this or draw it in your notes somewhere, and I recommend you do your best to apply what we know about memory to try to memorize these stages of cognitive development that Piaget came up with. So all you got to do is try to remember the name of each stage, the approximate age range of each, and then the kind of critical definition and description of the tasks that a baby can do when they are in that stage, what identifies that stage specifically. So my advice is stop the video now, fill in all you can remember from your reading, and then fill in the rest once you restart the video and hear me say all the things. And then mark what was different between what you remembered and what I say. Maybe have highlighters out, find some different pen colors, or just do some underlining. And then redraw the grid and try to write everything back in right after accurately, and then try to do it again in a week, and then again a week later. This is the kind of practice that is necessary for memorization of something like this. You could even do a little study on yourself. Look at all these different grids over time and see if you see yourself learning. See if you can tell that spacing out your practice works over time. And then try to decide whether you feel like that took more or less time than cramming it all in right before the final exam. So here's the stages. The first stage is the sensory motor stage. Lasts from birth to 2 years old. Babies are only usually acquiring information through their senses in the sensory motor stage, hence the name. They really only understand objects when they reflexively react to the sensory input of that object. This is why they're good at feeding. This is why they suck on a bottle or a nipple. This is why a baby grabs a finger if you put it in their face. And that's why they recognize the faces of their parents early on. They only really reflexively react to whatever is entering their sensory input. Around 2, Piaget thought that infants moved into the pre-operational stage, and really toddlerhood here, if not already. In the pre-operational stage, children can think about objects that aren't in their immediate view and have developed various conceptual models of how the world works. They do things like they start to think symbolically. They'll pick up sticks and turn them into toys, pretend that they're something else. Piaget believed that the main thing that a pre-operational child can't yet do is think operationally, hence the name again. They can't imagine the logical outcome of performing certain actions. So something that really clarifies this for me is thinking about lights being turned on and off. So at the operational stage, the concrete operational stage from 7 to 12 years, children start to learn the logic about the world around them. So an operation, again, is an action that can be done and then undone. And so this is the reason that children start to lose their fear of the dark around 7 years old, if they have it to begin with. And that is that they realize that a light switch can be flipped to eliminate the dark. So a light switch is a really classic operation. It can be on and off, or on and then off again, and then on again, and off again. It can be done and undone as many times as you like. And so they start to lose the fear of the darkness because they know that it can be undone. After about 12 years old and then on to now, children are in the formal operational stage, and then adults are in the formal operational stage as well. And this is the time at which a child can start to think abstractly. So they can do things like form hypotheses about a question in front of them, and then try to test the hypothesis through deductive logic. They can do things like test a theory or solve a problem. It's when children can finally solve a problem like the water glass problem that's shown in the example video here. This is a nice video that shows you examples of children doing tasks that represent all 4 stages. Further on, Piaget believed that children learn to move through these stages through 2 main mechanisms. The first is assimilation, which is the process through which children incorporate a new experience into an existing piece of knowledge about how the world works, or an existing schema. So this is the kind of, if a child is showing assimilation, let's say they have a cat at home and they go out to the park and see a rabbit, they might call the rabbit a cat in an act of assimilation. And then there is another method of learning called accommodation, where the schema is adapted or expanded to include a new experience. So they maybe would move their cat schema into a kind of small animal schema to come to understand that a rabbit is different from a cat. It sounds very much like our category learning discussion from earlier, so you can probably draw relationships there. Now, Piaget, of course, didn't know everything. There are some criticisms of the stages of learning. It doesn't seem super clear that every person goes through all of the stages and sub-stages that we didn't get into here in all the same order. And Piaget also believed that all children use the same kind of logic to solve problems, and that's not really true across children, and certainly not across cultures. So the framework he developed doesn't really give a lot of room for differing cognitive strategies among individuals. And even though there is some evidence in support of the stages of development, it seems like most kids move back and forth. Sometimes they'll appear to be in stage 3 on one day, and then they'll be back in stage 2 the day after, especially when they're around the ages in which Piaget thought that they were transitioning between one and the other. And the fact that they can move back and forth doesn't work for Piaget's theory, because the idea is that once you've moved from one stage to the next, it's like a light has come on, figuratively, and this is maybe not good with my previous example of light switches, but it's like the light is on and it can't be turned off. You're leaving the cave in Plato's allegory of the cave. You can't unknow what you know now. You know that. You know that I have a different visual perspective than you if we're sitting across the table from each other. And once you figure that out, you can't lose that piece of knowledge. And that doesn't seem to be true, because children will be able to achieve certain tasks one day and then not be able to complete that very same task the day after. It seems like they move back and forth a little bit. So a lot of developmental psychology lately has been kind of revising Piaget's theories, but his basic ideas have stayed pretty strong because they're They're pretty well composed. Most modern theorists believe that there's a lot of change in different areas of the brain that can show these differences in stage physically, and that's a part of all this that Piaget never quite got to know, because the research in fMRI obviously wasn't anywhere near as good as it is now. I don't believe it existed around when he died, and EEG research has come a long way since then as well. So we know a lot more about the physicality of the brain that has informed stage research in a useful way. As an alternative to Piaget's theory, I'll present you with those of Lev Vygotsky, who developed the sociocultural theory of cognitive development, in which he emphasized how other people around the child had a huge influence on children's development. So the values, the beliefs, the structure of the culture surrounding them was the biggest influence on how children developed, over and above their physical abilities, their mental capacities, their literal brain chemistry. He valued the way in which and the rate at which children internalize cultural values as their kind of main source of learning and information as they aged, as they grew. He really emphasized the importance of interpersonal communication, of children's ability to learn through talking with each other and through interacting with adults. And in fact, one of the most interesting areas of research in that for me is the research surrounding play. Play is defined in psychology as any action that a child or adult or animal acts in that isn't work, is fun, and is voluntary, and typically has the nature of being repetitive but also varied. Sort of confusing to say, but basically it's it goes by a typical format. Kids have games that they play all the time, and the games are the same every time in their structure, but they vary in what can happen within them in all the different instances. And so young people play, but so do young chimps and wolves, lots of other animals, even octopuses play when they're younger. From an evolutionary perspective, it's almost ubiquitous. There's animals playing at every level of the evolutionary chain, so it must be doing something important for us in our development. It's especially common in social animals with relatively long childhoods and lots of parental investment and large brains. So that's all us for sure, but also a lot of the animals like us. Any animal with a long childhood tends to spend a lot of that childhood playing. So what could the point be? What would the point of play be? Think about a theory for yourself. One reason psychologists have in mind is that as you play, you're kind of practicing possible future scenarios and trying to work at predicting the outcomes of your actions. So rats, for example, when they play, they look a lot like they're fighting. So there probably is some evolutionary purpose to the play in that they're preparing for fights. And then for humans, we're probably imagining how people might react to information. When you hear a toddler kind of play by themselves or develop stories by themselves, they're often trying out things that they might say in the future to other people rather than just to themselves. And when you play with another person, you can try that potential future action in a kind of play scenario, and you can get feedback for how it would react. Imagine that you were trying to design a robot that could adjust to the world around it as the world changed, the way animals and people do. What would you want to do? Well, you wouldn't want to design a robot that just did one thing. You would need a resilient robot that would adapt to new circumstances. And so in order to figure out a way that the robot can, let's say you design a walking robot and you want it to be able to get up when it gets knocked over, how are you going to build it to do that? It's very, very difficult questions. Because knocking it over is just one way that you could mess up a walking robot. But when an animal deals with a piece of adversity like that, it can fluidly adjust to those kinds of changes, and that's how that could be one of the purposes of play as well, to sort of train us to make us aware of how we might adapt to changes or limitations or obstacles. So if you want to take something away from this, if you have kids, or if you're going to have kids, or if you're around kids, it's best to let them play kind of randomly. You don't need to overly structure play. They're learning that they need from it. This kind of practicing and guessing and prediction that they'll learn from play will come naturally. You don't have to carefully structure question and answer sessions for them. So again, one of the things that Piaget didn't know about that has changed our knowledge of his theories over time is what we now know about the way the brain matures as people age. So from birth to 3 years, we start to see neural networks develop and branch and become the complex networks that will be necessary later on. But it's not until those networks branch and start to reintegrate and become complex that we see babies even be able to do complicated actions like walking and then talking and then remembering. Very, very complicated. And it turns out talking and developing language is hugely important. I've said before that language is the scaffold upon which we build memories and the context for how we learn. It is the stories that we make up. It's the stories that we live. It's how we define relationships and personality and our own personality. So in order to do any of the more complicated things the brain does, we need to adopt and learn language fairly early on. Once you turn 3, we start to see frontal lobes develop, which enables rational planning and things like self-control. And then beyond 6 years is when some of the more complicated things happen in the cortex, where these areas that are called association areas that are kind of spread all throughout the brain start to develop to enable really enriched thinking and memory and language in a way that sort of all the lobes are integrated and working together. Again, talking, big deal. This leads to some really interesting research on baby memory. The main couple of things we know is that most people experience infantile amnesia. The earliest conscious memories most people have are around 3 years old. If you feel like you have a memory from before then, you might, but you also might have just heard a story a couple of times and kind of generated a plausible memory surrounding it. Do you remember the age you were when you had your first memory? What is your first memory? Think about an example for yourself here. A nice example from research here is that after an emergency fire evacuation I believe in an apartment building, children that were 4 to 5 years old at the time of the evacuation remembered the alarm specifically and what caused it, but 3-year-olds did not. So there's a pretty sharp cutoff there between 3 and 4 to 5-year-olds. But even though we don't consciously remember things, we are still learning during those times. There's a 3-month-old in the picture here on the slide who can learn, and then if you put him back in a whole month later, could learn how to sort of pull his foot up to kick the item on the mobile above him. The sort of specific action that he would need to engage in to move the thing around has been learned, even though he wouldn't specifically have like a full-on experienceable, recallable memory from seeing the mobile in the past. I want to finish today up by considering the other side of cognitive development, which is how our cognitive system develops on the other end of the lifespan as we start to age. This is a photo of Helen Reichert, who in 2011, when she was 109 years old, she had 2 brothers who also lived to be 100. So she and they were both very highly adaptive cognitively. Her sort of self-history is that she bounced back from bad things quickly. She learned new things all the time. And so she felt like she was fairly sharp right up until she died, which is different from the experience that some folks have as they age into older adulthood. We know some things about cognitive development through the lifespan. The first is that recognition memory remains quite strong. People can recognize items from long in their past, all the way through the lifespan. Just if you give them the right cue, the memory is there. We see some decline in recall, so in free recall, things like short answer questions. Prospective memory declines a little bit too. That's the memory to complete a future action. But that memory also can remain strong in a recognition context. So if people put cues out for themselves, their prospective memory can function just like anyone else's, just like any younger person's, as long as they have the triggers available to them. So the easy example here is some kind of time-based or everyday task, like taking a pill. It can be easy to forget as you age unless you preset the right cues for yourself. But interestingly, sometimes the element of memory that is lacking most is people's confidence in their memory as they age. Things often don't decline nearly as fast as people think they decline. So that can be some of a way to deal with it, can be to think about the fact that you might be paying overly too much attention to what you feel like is a loss that actually is just a slight change. And it seems like some of this might be adaptive. Older adults recover more quickly from negative events. They tend to describe their lives more generally positively than people under 65 years old. And memory theorists are starting to believe that is not only adaptive, but also represents a fundamental change in memory and in cognition in later age, not unlike the theories of fundamental change in cognition from babyhood into toddlerhood and then young adulthood. So it probably isn't useful to think of older people's cognition as a weakened version of their younger selves, but it's actually a fully different version. But aging is an arena in general in which psychologists know surprisingly little in some ways. But it's a hot area. It's a place that's going to have, I think, lots more information and research very soon, because there's a lot of funding going to it. And we need that. Life expectancy around the world is rising. A couple interesting stories here about people aging. The kind of cognitive and health issues that are coming out for folks are things we've never had to think about or address before in the history of humanity. So we're headed into an interesting time for sure. And so we'll leave with that thought. I want you to finish today thinking about what you might imagine is an important research topic to consider as the world's population ages. And I want you to consider that knowing what you know now about the way cognition develops in babies and toddlers as well. So we know that there's kind of a fundamental difference in cognition from toddlerhood into adulthood, and then another fundamental difference between adulthood and older adulthood. So try to think about whether anything you know about young development can inform a question you have about older development. Thanks for watching. See you next time.